Episode 1 of The Gentleman introduces us to Eddie Horniman, who's serving overseas on a UN border mission in Turkey. He's approached by Ahmed, who works for his father, and learns that the Duke of Halstead's health is rapidly declining. Eddie returns home before it's too late. Now, Eddie is the second son of the Duke of Halstead, one of the wealthiest aristocrats in the country. When he returns to the estate, his father asks him to look after the family and keep an eye on his wayward older brother, Freddie. Now, after the Duke dies, the will is read and the family receive quite the surprise. Despite being the second-born son, Eddie is inheriting everything. The title, the estate and the land will all belong to him. The rest of the family will receive an allowance, of course, but Eddie gets to decide how much. Naturally, Freddie takes this about as well as you'd expect. The problem is, Freddie has much bigger worries than hurt pride. He owes a massive debt to a guy called Tommy Dixon, who's a very dangerous Liverpudlian cocaine dealer. And if he doesn't pay up, he's basically a dead man walking. Now, Freddie asks Eddie for help, but while Eddie has inherited an enormous estate, he quickly realises he is asset rich and cash poor. In other words, he has a lot of land and not much actual money. So Eddie starts looking at ways to raise funds, including selling Halstead Manor. However, things get even more complicated when Susie Glass enters the picture. She reveals that Eddie's father had been making £5 million a year by allowing her family's cannabis operation to run underneath the estate. Now that Eddie owns the estate, he's also inherited that same problem too. Eddie wants out, but Susie makes it clear the leaving will not be simple. She also offers to help reduce Freddie's debt if Eddie agrees to cooperate. Eddie then meets Stanley Johnston, a wealthy aristocrat who's very interested in buying Halstead Manor. He makes Eddie a huge offer for the estate, but Eddie turns him down for now. Instead, Eddie reluctantly agrees to sell him the family wine collection for several £1,000,000, giving him a way to help Freddie. Unfortunately, Freddie being Freddie, manages to make things a lot worse. Rather than using the money properly, Freddie gets dragged into a ridiculous scheme involving an illegal boxing match, hoping to double the cash and clear his debt in one go. Naturally, the whole thing falls apart. Susie steps in and manages to negotiate Tommy Dixon's demand down, but there is one humiliating condition. Freddie has to dress up in a chicken suit, dance around and apologise on camera. It's ridiculous, degrading, and Freddie's pride certainly takes a battering. In the middle of this humiliation, he snaps, grabbing a shotgun, and shoots Tommy Dixon dead. Episode 2 of The Gentleman picks up right after Freddie shoots Tommy Dixon. Eddie, Jeff and Freddie chase after Tommy's money man, Jethro, who has seen absolutely everything. Now, Freddie's immediate suggestion is to kill him, because of course it is, but Eddie refuses to murder an innocent man. Unfortunately, before they catch him, Jethro manages to send a garbled text to Tommy's crew. It doesn't make much sense, but it is enough to raise suspicions. Susie quickly explains that Tommy may have been a low-level problem, but his brother is most certainly not. Now, that brother is John the Gospel Dixon, a very dangerous cocaine dealer with a religious streak and a short temper. Susie calls in Felix, a professional cleaner, to dispose of Tommy's body. Felix is more than happy to bury Tommy somewhere no one will ever find him, but he also thinks Jethro should be killed too. Now, Eddie refuses and comes up with a different plan. He intends to frame Jethro for Tommy's murder, send him out of the country and hope John Dixon buys his story. It's not exactly a flawless plan, but at this point their options are rather limited. John the Gospel Dixon then arrives at Halstead Manor looking for his brother. Eddie lies, claiming Tommy took the money and left after finishing his business. John is not convinced, especially because of Jethro's strange text, but Eddie manages to keep his cool. Later, Eddie heads to Jethro's flat to get his passport so they can smuggle him out of the country. Unfortunately, one of John's men happened to be there. A brutal fight breaks out and Eddie's military training kicks in. He kills the man, but not before being stabbed in the side. Elsewhere, Eddie attends Stanley Johnston's party, where Susie reveals that Stanley is not really interested in Halstead Manor for cultural reasons. He knows about the cannabis farm underneath the estate, and that's where his interest has peaked. Stanley is a billionaire meth dealer looking to move into the weed business, and he offers Susie a partnership. Susie doesn't exactly leap at the chance, but it is clear Stanley is going to be a problem. Back at the estate, Eddie's plan starts to come together. Tommy's body is found along with his phone, which still has that glorious video of Freddy dressed as a chicken. Eddie plants evidence to make it look like Jethro killed Tommy, stole the money and ran away. As for Jethro, Eddie gives him cash and sends him away, hoping he'll leave the country and never come back. However, there is another twist here, as Felix appears to be the one escorting Jethro away. Given Felix wanted him dead from the start, that doesn't exactly scream a happy ending. It's here that he also meets Bobby Glass, Susie's father, and makes him an offer. Eddie wants the Glass family off his land by the end of the year, and in exchange he promises to make them a lot more money before they leave. Episode 3 of The Gentleman begins with Jimmy transporting a van full of weed. Unfortunately, Jimmy being Jimmy, he stops for a bite to eat and meets a woman named Gabrielle. He thinks this is a lovely chance encounter, but in reality it's actually a trap. Gabrielle and her sister steal his keys and make off with the van, which is a rather large problem given Susie's client is waiting for that shipment. That client is Tony Blair. Tony, spelt with an I rather than a Y, the leader of a Kosovan Albanian gang, and he's not exactly known for his patience either. When Susie tells Tony the delivery is delayed, he offers an alternative. He wants her to steal a heavily modified green Lamborghini Huracan. Since Susie's men are busy trying to find the stolen van, she turns to Eddie for help. Eddie agrees and the plan is set. In fact, it's split into 2 stages. First, they need to clone the key, and then they need to steal the car. To pull this off, Eddie gets Freddy and Tamsin to pose as wealthy prospective buyers. Naturally, Freddy is a walking disaster, but somehow Eddie manages to clone the key despite his dicey demeanour. Meanwhile, Jimmy is found unconscious and naked in the woods. When he awakens, he remembers Gabrielle as some sort of angel from the sky rather than a con woman. Susie is less enchanted and orders her people to find Gabrielle and recover the missing weed. While this is happening, Eddie manages to steal the Lamborghini, but while doing so, he also finds a man being held captive by Mercy, the car's very dangerous owner. And this is when the real reason Tony wanted the Lamborghini becomes clear. He doesn't actually care about the car itself, but instead wants the 150 kilos of cocaine hidden inside the trunk. It soon dawns on our characters that Eddie and Susie have not just stolen a car, but instead have actually stepped into the middle of a much bigger drug dispute. Things get worse though when Mercy captures Freddy and demands the return of both the car and the cocaine. Now Eddie and Susie have no choice but to comply, but Susie manages to turn the situation around by offering Tony Blair to Mercy instead. Mercy then kills Tony in front of everyone, making it very clear she's not someone to be trifled with. Thankfully, Freddy is allowed to leave. As for the stolen weed van, Jimmy later receives a call from Gabrielle and somehow still agrees to meet her again for dinner. Gabrielle and her sister then torch the van, destroying the weed inside and bringing the episode to a tenuous end. Episode 4 of The Gentleman opens with Freddy and Jimmy off on a fishing trip. Freddy is still desperate to prove himself, telling Jimmy that he's an asset rather than a liability. Given everything Freddy has done so far, he's not exactly making a great case for himself. Now meanwhile, Susie is looking for ways to expand the weed business, and Eddie agrees to help her find a new underground site. The deal here is simple. He helps the Glass family make more money, and they leave Halstead by the end of the year. That opportunity arrives when Eddie attends the funeral of the 8th Lord Bassington. His son Max is about to inherit the estate, and Eddie sees this as the perfect chance to strike a deal with him. Max is a wannabe Hollywood actor, best known for an old shampoo advert, and he seems pretty open to the idea of making some extra cash. Max has a problem of his own though that needs dealing with. He's being blackmailed by a man named Frank, who happens to be a disgraced journalist who claims to have documents that could destroy him. With a Hollywood audition coming up, Max needs the issue dealt with quietly. Now Eddie and Susie track Frank down and get hold of the documents. Eddie doesn't look at them, but he does insist that Frank come with them to Max's estate to collect the ransom. This is where things get very weird. It turns out Frank is not blackmailing Max's father, but actually blackmailing Max himself. Under pressure here, Max takes him into a secret underground room filled with Adolf Hitler paintings and Nazi memorabilia. It turns out he's a full-blown Hitler obsessive. And because this is a Guy Ritchie series and we haven't had some eccentricity for a while, he also claims to own Hitler's preserved missing testicle. Naturally, things spiral from there. A scuffle breaks out, Max and Frank clash, and the German Shepherd ends up swallowing the preserved testicle. Susie eventually takes control of the situation in her usual way, making it very clear to Max that he is going to cooperate. Meanwhile, Jimmy continues seeing Gabrielle, still completely unaware that she's the one who helped steal the van full of weed. He even takes her to the secret cannabis lab too, showing Jimmy's complete lack of survival instinct. Elsewhere, Jeff helps Sabrina look for another possible site for the weed operation. This leads them to a local sheep farmer, giving Susie and Eddie another potential location outside of Halstead. By the end of the episode, Susie now has options for expanding the business, while Eddie is one step closer to getting the Glass family off his estate. At least, that's the plan anyway. I mean, what could go wrong? Episode 5 of The Gentleman opens with Susie visiting her father, Bobby Glass, in his luxury prison. Now, prison is probably the wrong word though, because this place looks more like a private members' club with bars on the windows. Susie explains that Eddie has now helped them find new locations for the weed operation, which means he believes he's fulfilled his side of the bargain. As far as Eddie is concerned though, the Glass family should now start moving off his estate. Bobby, however, is not so keen to let him go. He thinks Eddie is too useful, and he also suspects Eddie may have developed a taste for the business. When Susie asks Eddie about this, he shuts the idea down immediately. However, Susie still needs his help. The Glass family move around £80 million worth of weed through Sea Bruges every year, but their shipments have recently been seized by Belgian police. The problem appears to be Florian de Groot, their man at the port, who now wants an extra £1.5 million to keep things ticking over. Susie tries negotiating him down, but Eddie quickly realises Florian can't be trusted and suggests finding another way. Before they can deal with that properly, the power at the lab goes out. Someone has stolen the generator, and when Eddie and Susie investigate, they discover the culprits are children from the Ward family. Now, the Wards are Irish travellers, and one of the women here explains that they need the generator to keep the kids warm. Eddie takes pity on them and lets them keep one of the generators. The next day, Eddie and Susie meet JP Ward, the head of the family. JP already knows about the weed farm underneath Halstead and offers to help them, provided the Wards get a piece of the operation. Susie is pretty open to the idea, especially when Eddie realises the Wards could help move their product through Europe without relying on Florian. As a gesture of goodwill, Eddie also allows the Wards to park their caravans on his land. To be fair, JP absolutely delivers here. The Wards manage to smuggle the weed by hiding it inside a statue of the Virgin Mary. However, trouble soon hits the estate again when £4 million is stolen from the lab. Suspicion immediately falls on the Wards, and when Eddie confronts JP, things become rather tense. Now, Eddie starts putting the pieces together though, and realises the Wards are being blamed here is far too convenient. They're very clearly red herrings, and if the new route fails, the person who benefits most here is Florian himself. So Eddie and Susie arrange another meeting with Florian, where they poison his food and offer him the antidote in exchange for the truth. It's here Florian reveals that the thief was Keith, one of Susie's own men. Eddie hands Keith over to JP, and Keith is shot for betraying the operation. But before he dies, he gives Eddie one final warning. He tells him not to trust Susie. He then reveals that Jeffro never left the country, but instead was killed on Susie's orders. Episode 6 of The Gentleman opens with Eddie visiting Jeff at his cottage. After learning what happened to Jethro, Eddie admits Jeff was right about Susie Glass all along. Now, if Eddie tries to walk away from the business, he could easily end up just like Jethro. Jeff advises him to stay calm, play the long game, and be ready for anything. Meanwhile, Susie brings Eddie another problem. The Glass family need to launder £15 million before they can officially count it as profit and move forward with leaving the estate. The issue is that this could take months, which Eddie immediately sees as another delayed tactic. Susie takes him to meet Chucky, the man who usually launders their money. Immediately we see that Chucky is loud, ridiculous, and very proud of his ability to clean cash through various businesses. However, things quickly fall apart when Chucky catches Jack, Susie's brother, sleeping with his girlfriend. Chucky confronts him, Jack punches him, and just like that, the Glass family's money laundering route goes right down the drain. With Jack now needing somewhere safe to lie low before his big fight, Susie asks Eddie to keep him at Halstead Manor. Eddie then looks for another solution and turns to Henry Collins, Jack's boxing promoter. Henry introduces him to Thick Rick, a painfully boring accountant who has a very detailed plan for washing the money through boxing bets. It's undoubtedly dull, but it also works quite well, impressing Eddie. Susie, however, wants Eddie to stick with Chucky once she patches things up with him. Eddie goes along with this at first, but then learns Chucky has been told to take his time with the laundering. This all but confirms what he already suspected anyway. Susie and Bobby have no real intention of leaving Halstead anytime soon. Eddie loses his temper, takes the money from Chucky, and gives it to Henry instead. When Susie confronts him, Eddie makes it clear that he now understands the game she's playing. She tells him he is already too deeply involved to walk away, but Eddie warns her not to mistake his manners for weakness. If he has to go to war with the Glass family, then so be it. Eddie also reaches out to Stanley Johnston here, seemingly looking for help in removing the Glasses from his estate. This is obviously pretty dangerous, because Stanley is not exactly the sort of man you invite into your problems unless you're ready for a much bigger one. Meanwhile, Henry makes his own move by summoning Susie and revealing that he knows about the weed operation. He wants to take over the business, and if Susie resists, Jack will pay the price. Susie warns Henry that he's starting a war he's not smart enough to win, but Henry has already fixed Jack's fight. During the match, Jack is brutally beaten by Henry's ringer and left badly injured, giving Henry exactly the leverage that he wanted. Episode 7 of The Gentleman opens after Jack's brutal defeat in the ring. Jimmy visits Eddie and tells him that Jack is alive but badly injured. Eddie then tracks Susie down and offers his condolences, while also making it clear he had nothing to do with what happened. Eddie offers to help her take down Henry Collins, but Susie refuses. She wants to handle this herself, and judging by her mood, Henry is in serious trouble. As Susie visits Bobby in prison and tells him that Jack's prognosis is looking better. She also reveals she has already taken out 2 of Henry's men, although Henry himself is still hiding. Bobby warns Susie to stop and let him deal with it, but Susie is not exactly in a listening mood. Meanwhile, Eddie meets Stevens, Stanley Johnston's associate. Stevens insists Stanley had nothing to do with Jack's attack before asking Eddie for the list of aristocratic estates being used by Bobby Glass for the weed operation. Stanley wants leverage over Bobby, and Eddie knows that list could be his way out. Eddie asks Sabrina about it, and she remembers that Archibald once attended a dinner at Fairbourne with a group of other lords. Since Fairbourne now belongs to Tipsy, Eddie and Freddie head over to investigate. Now at the manor, Eddie manages to find the names he needs in Tipsy's records. Unfortunately, things do not go especially smoothly, with Freddie losing his trousers and Eddie losing his watch. It's just classic Freddie behaviour by this point, let's be honest. Elsewhere, Henry decides he can't just wait for Susie to find him. He contacts her directly and warns that if she goes near any more of his men, he will have her killed. Susie realises Henry knows where she lives, which means someone close to her must have leaked her location. When questioned, Jimmy admits that he may have accidentally told Gabrielle where Susie is staying. Eddie then asks him to arrange a meeting with her. Gabrielle eventually admits that she doesn't work for Henry Collins at all, as she was actually hired by Stanley Johnston. This means that Stanley was behind the stolen weed van, the disruption to Susie's European routes, and the pressure on the Glass business all along. Henry was also working for Stanley, but his impatience led to Jack being badly injured. Susie decides to use Gabrielle rather than kill her, although she makes it very clear that any double cross in the future will end very badly. As the episode nears its end, Eddie hands the estate list over to Stevens. Stevens then passes orders down to Henry, telling him to deal with Jack and Susie. However, Susie gets to Henry first and captures him. Through Henry's confessions, Susie realises Eddie has been making moves behind her back, and she responds in the most destructive way possible. She calls John the Gospel Dixon and tells him the truth. Freddie killed Tommy, and the Horniman brothers covered it up. Episode 8 of The Gentleman opens its finale with a monologue from Stanley Johnston about conformity. On the surface, Stanley presents himself as a refined, harmless businessman, but he is very much a wolf in a very expensive sheep's suit. Back at Halstead Manor, things are looking pretty bleak. John Dixon arrives with his men after learning that Freddie killed Tommy and Eddie helped cover it up. He surrounds the estate and demands that Freddie come outside or they will storm the house. Freddie, realising this is all his fault, actually agrees to give himself up to protect the family. Eddie refuses to let him do that though, and the situation looks seconds away from turning into a complete bloodbath. Bobby Glass then calls John. We don't hear every detail of their conversation, but whatever Bobby offers, it's enough to make John stand down and leave. This means Freddie lives to see, or mess up I guess, another day. Afterwards, Bobby summons Eddie and Susie and tells them to make peace. He points out that both of them were trying to protect their families, even if they went about it in very different ways. Bobby then drops a bombshell, revealing that he's retiring and intends to sell the Glass Empire to the highest bidder. Eddie warns him that this plays right into Stanley Johnston's hands, but Bobby seems pretty resolute in his decision. As a result of this, Eddie and Susie are tasked with gathering bids from the major interested parties, including Stanley, Mercy and Sticky Pete. However, as the process unfolds, Eddie starts to change his mind. Eddie begins to realise that if someone else takes over the glass business, his family and estate may still never be free. The only way to control the problem may be to control the business itself, so Eddie decides to bid. The biggest obstacle to all of this though is obviously money. So Eddie pulls together funds from the other aristocratic estate owners, JP and the Ward family, and even his mother Sabrina, who offers up a serious chunk of money by selling valuables. Eddie also approaches Henry Collins. He's isolated and desperate, so Eddie takes advantage of this. In exchange for protection and a place in the bid, Henry agrees to provide a large amount of money for him. Finally, Eddie brings Susie in properly, and the two do agree to work together. Their final bid comes to £235 million. Of course, even that is not enough to beat Stanley Johnston, who has far more money and is clearly the favourite, so Eddie and Susie change the game. The pair arrange for Stanley to be arrested for tax evasion, taking him out of the running completely. They then use Henry Collins to deal with Mercy, removing another major rival from the board. As for Henry himself, Eddie and Susie turn on him too. After everything he did to Jack, Henry was never walking away cleanly. By the end, Eddie and Susie are the only real candidates left. Bobby then drops an absolute bombshell. It turns out he was never actually retiring in the way he claimed. The whole thing was a test to see whether Eddie and Susie could think strategically, remove their enemies, and prove themselves capable of operating at this higher level. Of course, they've both passed with flying colours. Bobby accepts their £235 million and brings them into the business, with Eddie and Susie now working as partners. The season then ends with Stanley Johnston joining Bobby in that luxury prison, while Eddie fully embraces the criminal world he spent the entire season trying to escape. And that is where season 1 comes to a close. Thanks for watching, and do let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Smash a like or subscribe to the channel, your support is very much appreciated. I'm Greg Wheeler, and from all of us over here at The Review Geek, we'll see you on the next video.